Okay, so consistent with the overall theme for TAPS, what I want to focus on particularly is partnerships and this whole research to policy practice linkage within a complex system. I've deliberately collaborated on this presentation with Cameron Willis, who's currently an NHRDP scholar, a Sydney Sax scholar, and Barb Riley, who's the executive director of the Propel Center for Population Health Impact. So Barb and I have done lots of collaboration around systems thinking, population health for many years, and Cameron's been a huge asset, just a fantastic guy. We've been working on a variety of initiatives, and you'll see those as we go through. As we should with any partnership, I'd like to spend a second talking about exactly who we are and what we're all about. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how complex systems are different and about what models there are for thinking about how we link research, policy, and practice. But I'd like to get through that fairly quickly, suspecting that many of you are pretty familiar with that broad brush perspective on this complexity lens. What I'd really like to do is spend most of the time around the question of, so how do we do that? What are the simple rules or the basic principles for moving from knowledge to action? And I'm going to present half a dozen different examples from Canada to plant some seeds around how we might start to think about things differently. We really don't know how to do it yet, so this is a collaborative effort with you in the room right now. We'll see if we can't start to clarify what are some of the things that really are important in making these kinds of partnerships work, and then what would be some next steps in building those for the future. We started this work 15 years ago now with major funding from our NHMRC equivalent, which is called the Canadian Institute for Health Services Research, and we had operating grants around partnering with the community and doing things that would improve integration and outcomes. We, as we worked, learned that we had to get pretty familiar and facile with different areas of knowledge. It wasn't just about partnering. We had to know a fair bit about knowledge exchange, systems thinking, transdisciplinarity as well. As we got towards the end of the 10-year funding that we had, we took a look at the kind of bridges that we'd been building with the real world and realized the bridges didn't match up very well. While both the research producers and the research consumers wanted to be bridging to the other, they lived in different worlds and were really yelling at each other across the vacuum. What we wanted was something like the London Bridge in the 16th century, where we lived together, do business together, go to church together, right on the same bridge. But that kind of structure really didn't exist, and that's what led us to form the InSearch Research Group. We still do lots of academic work and get grant funding for that, but increasingly we want to work directly with decision makers and have them fund the work so that it's the kind of thing they want and they can get what they need when they need it. The Propel Center is using a different model. It's embedded and hosted by the University of Waterloo, but it's explicitly a strong collaboration between academia and various government and non-government organizations. It's truly pan-Canadian, so it has a mandate to try to work towards increasing population health research impact across the country. It's really become, in effect, a part of the infrastructure that Canada has for trying to create these linkages, not unlike what TAPS is trying to do in Australia, I think. It specifically focuses strongly on integrating research policy and practice perspectives and getting those different perspectives working together. One of the points that Barb Riley asked me to make is that while their current programs are around tobacco control, healthy living, capacity development, more generally, and this has been true for 30 years since I was first engaged with these folks, there's a strong emphasis on developing common measures across jurisdictions. And that's one of the questions I'll come back to at the end is there a place for us to work together around developing some of those measures of partnership performance, youth behaviors in school environments, that kind of thing, which is very much a priority for Propel and I think increasingly a priority for TAPS as well. So very quickly, what do we mean by complex systems and how are they different? There is no well-understood consensus about what we mean. We are tending to talk largely about complex adaptive systems and the theoretical and science perspectives behind that. It's a discipline that views frameworks as the whole and looks at how the different parts in the puzzle interact dynamically with each other. So it's very organic, it's very nonlinear. Traditional ways of doing science that are more reductionistic and management practices around command and control simply don't work in that kind of a world. It demands much more of a dynamic, continuous learning and adaptation environment. And the question that we'll address today is, what are the implications of that shift in paradigm then for how we think about knowledge integration? It's really a very fundamentally different paradigm, and this summarizes some of the major differences between what's called a complicated and a complex system. I'm not going to say a lot about this. There's lots written about it if you want to get into it more. But you can see just from the comparison that's here on this slide that it requires a very different way of running organizations, a different way of providing leadership, a different way of building in evaluation and methodologies, different way of learning. So that's what we're going to try to come together with, is what are some of the implications of these fundamental differences for the way we do the work we do. Okay, what are the ways we already have used historically around thinking about how we link research, policy, and practice? I chaired a working group from the National Cancer Institute of Canada several years ago that started to look at how the thinking about the whole knowledge to practice model had changed over the decades. We'd started out with a linear model sometime in the 60s that continued through until the 90s that basically said knowledge is a product, researchers produce it, you hand it off to the people that are going to use it, and Bob's your uncle, there you go. Increasingly, it was clear that way of thinking about it wasn't achieving very much. The actual implementation wasn't very good. So we needed new ways of thinking about it. In the mid-90s, Jonathan Lomas in Canada really led the charge on completely redefining the way we think about the field. He really talked about it as being relationship-based, so that knowledge is exchanged between people, and it's how those people are interacting together, the kind of linkage and exchange that there is in the system, that's going to determine whether or not effective implementation takes place. The most common model for us these days in terms of thinking about that is one that Ian Graham published several years ago, and then soon after became the VP knowledge translation for our major funder, the CIHR. So his model had an impact. And basically what the model does is say that at each of the stages in the whole knowledge production, dissemination, implementation process, there are specific things that the different partners need to attend to, and they're different collaborations at each stage. And so it told us a fair bit about what an effective partnership around this kind of exchange model might look like. But when the NCI started to look at it, we started to feel that the knowledge products are embedded within relationships, but the relationships are embedded within organizations and systems. And unless we look at that context in which we're trying to do the implementation process, it ain't going to work. So you can see with this different way of thinking about it, we chose to call that knowledge integration to really underscore the outcome that we were looking for, that it's really a tightly woven process where the research is fully embedded in the whole planning and implementation process of the organization. It has to be aligned with priorities and resources. And the success is going to be a function of the degree to which you're successful in integrating your knowledge exchange, mobilization, whatever you want to call it, process as part of the way the organization does business. There are no perfect models of what that kind of system thinking might look like, but this model of the knowledge cycle that comes from the Public Health Agency of Canada is pretty good. It focuses on capacity building at the middle with the collaboration between practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. It makes a heavy emphasis on context and understanding that the way knowledge is produced and used is going to vary from situation to situation, and then leads people through the cycle of learning both from practice and from research to come up with the best advice for how to change things. So with that quick snapshot, some of the things I think we can conclude are that we do need systems thinking for thinking about this whole production implementation process. However, to do that effectively, we're going to have to learn more about system dynamics and knowledge to action. The collaborative relationships between the partners are likely to have to start with shared mental models. We have to have a common way of thinking about and talking about the problems if we're going to work together effectively. There won't be a silver bullet. The model's going to have to be tailored to specific contexts, and different models, different ways of thinking will be important in different contexts, and we need to be flexible enough to suit those to purpose. And that finally, we're going to need analytic tools to test these different models, because at the moment they're just pie in the sky, ways of thinking about what it is that we're doing. We don't have good tests yet of how these different models work, and we need them. But we may have to develop quite different methodologies, measures, evaluation strategies to get that knowledge. Okay, so with that kind of a background, are there some simple rules for how we move from knowledge to action? And what can we learn from Canadian examples? The first one I'm going to talk about is the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. It was created, I think, 7 or 8 years ago now, after a long process of the different cancer control agencies in the country agreeing that they needed to work more closely together and what that might look like. It got $50 million a year for 5 years funding from the federal government, so it was well funded to play this kind of a coordination role. What they needed to do on the prevention side was to create this common language and logic. So we've used concept mapping to do that. I'll talk more about that. Once the map had been done using web-based tools, people came together for a series of 3 two-day national meetings to think about what all the data meant. Total of something like 500 participants, creating a broad-based buy-in across the country for what our strategy should look like. And then CLASP went on to fund various coalitions and exchange meetings to actually implement the new strategy that was being envisioned. With concept mapping, what you start with is a specific question. In this case, you can see that it's specific actions that would improve prevention of cancer and other major chronic diseases. You put it on the web, invite people to respond. We got nearly 500 different ideas posted to this. Then a small working group sits down and reflects on what those mean, how we could distill them by combining similar items, clearing up the language a little bit, and ended up in this case with 114 good statements that we could then plug in to ask people how to make sense of them. What you do is put it back on the web at that point, ask people to sort them, ask people to rate them, ask people to describe how they fit together. And after a fairly sophisticated multivariate cluster analysis, this is the kind of map you come back to. I'm just going to leave with you for a second the pieces to the puzzle that these 500 odd stakeholders think are important if we're to develop a comprehensive prevention strategy. I don't think any of them are going to be surprising. But what's important to see is that the map doesn't tell you how to do it. It's like having the pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, but you don't know which ones fit where. So that what we still have to do to really convert this to a complex, dynamic way of thinking about the problem is to start to understand what is the interplay between these different elements, how do they work together, what are some of the places to start, what are some of the specific ways you could implement these. And that's what we really need to start thinking about, that the concept mapping process didn't do. It's useful to provide some initial starting points, so that, for example, one of the ways of looking at it that the software pumps out is this comparison between how important is an idea and how feasible is an idea. One of the interesting things you can note is that there isn't a strong correlation. The things that are important may not be feasible. The things that are feasible may not be that important. So what the 2 days of meetings at the end do is to look at these data and to say, okay, what does that tell us about where are some of the go, no-go zones? Where are some of the things that are both feasible and practical that we could start with? Over time, how can we look to some of the things that are going to be most important about transforming the system? What do we need to do to start to make some of those things happen? So you can see how this kind of tool is very useful in getting partnerships to work together towards a common language and logic. Not a quick fix, not a simple answer, but it gets us started. The second example I want to talk to is work that was commissioned by the Saskatchewan Ministry of Health. There was a pilot program that CIHR was funding to get researchers to look at the questions that were important to policymakers. So every 6 months, the government got to frame a question that it wanted answered, and then there was a group of pre-approved centers, research centers, that could bid on it, and if they had the best bid, they'd get to provide to work with the province to establish that answer. The ministry had 4 different initiatives on the go that they all now were coming to understand were truly transformative. They were going to make the system different, and they didn't know how to do that. There were surgical wait lists, patient and family-centered care, and other priorities as well. The ministry was pretty sophisticated already. It knew the kinds of things that were going to be important about large-scale system change. They knew about interorganizational collaboration, the kind of things you probably know about here. These are the things we need to do. They were particularly interested in the question of what the government's role would be in this kind of a formula. But what they didn't know is how they would actually do these things, and that's what they kept stressing. They kept saying, we know what to do. How are we going to do it? What we did is develop a methodology we'd been working with for some time, some 20 different rapid reviews that we'd done, using a realist methodology to start with, but deliberately partnering with other folks so we could make it happen more quickly. So we'd set up a steering committee that had the senior leaders from the government that were going to use this work. We'd combine that with our own synthesis team and an expert panel. What we discovered, much to our delight, is if you ask the world's top researchers in a particular area, how would you guys like to work together to make sense of what you're doing? They say, wow, what an opportunity. We never get to do that. So we don't even have to pay them. But we'd structure it as regular web-based tasks, never demanding more than 30 minutes in a week of their time, that we could work them through to help us define what are the right research questions, what are the key articles to start with, and so on. With this one, we added a consensus network, which meant some 100 different respondents from over 10 different countries who were actually doing system change. So we fed back to them what the literature review was telling us and said, does this sound right? And what does that actually look like in your practice? Something like 100 pages of qualitative text in terms of how that looks the way they do it. And based on that, we were able to make a lot of sense, and we think collaboratively with the end users and the experts, develop recommendations that really would be useful to the government. So I'm not going to go into any detail on this, as you just saw on the last slide. It's published now. But essentially, what you'll see when you go into the detail is that the process looks very similar to the way you do a traditional Cochrane-style review. You do a pretty good job of finding the right literature, synthesizing it fairly rigorously, and so on. Where it differs is this heavy involvement of the other teams, the expert panel and the reference group, to make sense of things and come up with a combined wisdom around the recommendations at the end of the day. The 5 key lessons that come out of the literature in terms of how do you transform a large system are that you need to have quite a different style of leadership that's both top-down and bottom-up. It's really distributed throughout the organization where everybody feels they have some role and tasks that they should be performing as part of transforming the system. Heavy reliance on good feedback and reporting. So you're constantly learning from the system how you're doing, what's working, what's not. And key questions around how do you design that kind of a feedback loop then. Historical context is critical. You have to do things in a way that makes sense for the context, the jurisdiction within which you're doing this. So in this particular case, Saskatchewan had invented universal health care. They had a long history of doing collaborative things to try to make it a better place to live. So by aligning these kinds of strategies with that historical context, we felt that it could work much better. Huge issues around engagement and power. The literature says that you should listen to the docs, that it's the physicians that have the power in the system, and of course, they're right to a significant extent, and that's what the literature talks about. But when we fed that back to our external consensus panel, they said, what? I mean, there were a lot of leading nurses and others on the group who recognized the need for a much stronger shift towards interprofessional teams. And we would support that. But the point is that we need to do a better job of engaging the different stakeholder groups and really working through these power issues if you expect to be successful in transforming the system. And then finally, the literature is very clear that you need to be person-centered. It really needs to focus on the patient and the family, or in the prevention context, you'll use different language. But it isn't clear how to do that. Almost all the researchers using patient representatives on steering committees and that kind of thing. Nobody's going directly to the context of what's happening in the doctor's office or what's happening at the community clinic, whatever it is. And so that we need a much better understanding of how that plays in practice at the front lines. The next example is the second study that we did for the province. Having figured out that this is what they wanted to do, they then wanted to ask, so if a cultural shift is really what is going to bind this together, how do you sustain cultural transformations over time, and how do you assess that organizational culture and whether it's working or not? We didn't end up with very good answers for how you assess. There isn't a good literature on it, although if you look at our final report, you'll find that there certainly are lots of emergent suggestions around the kinds of evaluation that you would do. But this is what came out as the guiding principles in sustaining the culture in terms of aligning vision with action, distributing the leadership. I'm going to go over a lot of these things fairly quickly because you're going to start to see across the examples that we're looking at is this huge consistency in terms of the simple rules that seem to come out. It's always about a different style of leadership. It's always about better engagement. It's also always about paying attention to the relationships and so on. Now, the fourth example is from work that's currently going on at the University of Waterloo with Barb Riley's group. The advisory team is interesting. Barb Riley, who's an academic, still in an academic setting, Allan Best, who's trying to recover from that, Diane Finegood, who's CEO of a major funder, and Carrie Robinson, who's a scientist with the Public Health Agency of Canada. The reason I'm underscoring this is because it's a collaboration that involves, in this case, 4 different academics who have a lot of common ground to start with, have then moved into very different arenas. Each have their own networks of experts that you can bring in as needed for particular projects. And it's one way to promote this kind of cross-sectoral collaboration that we're finding work particularly well. With this project, what we were doing is looking at 9 diverse cases, all of which have been selected for doing an outstanding job around linking knowledge to action, using a systems thinking perspective, and used a variety of document reviews and interviews to try to get answers. What we came up with in that case are 5 simple rules. The article has just been accepted for publication, and I can provide access to that if you want it. But again, the importance of establishing and nurturing the relationship, almost always underestimated in terms of how much work that's going to take to really get that right. The idea of co-producing, but also curating knowledge. Keeping it in a central place, getting the right information to the right place at the right time, figuring out how to manage that whole process more effectively. Again, creating feedback loops. Fundamental, and this is the first project that we've seen this with, projects are not projects. System interventions can't be seen that way. They have to be seen as a prototyping of, well, the system's going to try to do things differently, and over time we'll learn how to do that better. But the first time around we'll probably get it wrong. Probably still be lots of room for improvement. So how can we start to take the project funding kinds of mechanisms that are available to us and use them for a much more longitudinal transformative process that's really going to be what's needed if the system is going to change meaningfully. And then finally a recognition that it's not going to be neat. You're going to need different kinds of supports at different times in different contexts, and somehow you're going to have to orchestrate that dance so that you have the right strategy at the right time in the right place. And again, no simple guidelines for how to do that. Yeah, we know it's what we have to do, but we don't know how. Okay, the 5th example focuses in specifically on network performance. You'll find, certainly in Australia, certainly it's what TAPS is all about at its core. Everybody says that organizational networks are the way to do it, right? There's not much there that tells us how. So we're having to learn as we go about how to run an effective interorganizational network, particularly if they're larger, more complex than the partnerships that we've had in the past. So as a first step, what this study aims to do is to identify and explore what are some of the outcomes that those interorganizational networks are trying to achieve. Let's just get clear on what they think is important, and then we can study that more rigorously and build on it from there. Again, using concept mapping, in this case using a much smaller number of participants, each of whom are leaders within one of these prevention networks. The prompt for this one is a meaningful measure of network outcomes is. Very simple question about what is it you think you're trying to achieve by being in a network, generating a bunch of statements and then putting it through that cluster analysis process to get a handle on it. And this is what it looks like. Now this one, I find interesting. I'm actually going to refer to notes a little bit as I walk you through it. What you'll see is that the bottom 5 clusters are largely around intermediate outcomes, using resources effectively, enhancing learning, improving relationships, and so on, right? The central cluster of improved intersectoral engagement is really about how we end up tying it all together and trying to use that collaboration most effectively. And then the top 3 clusters are much more impact-oriented in terms of what we're trying to achieve together. Yes? All good. But here are some of the things that concern me about it. Leadership and power are missing as key factors. Why? We know that those are going to be critical to system change, so why don't they show up here? Well, the question asked about outcomes, and maybe people don't see leadership and power change as an outcome that they're working towards. But all these other projects we've been talking about suggest that in fact it's critical. And if you don't get leadership and power sharing working differently, the system change isn't going to work very well. So why isn't it there? The key integrative factor, the improved intersectoral engagement, has a particularly low importance rating. What? How can that be? And what do you mean by improved intersectoral engagement? It's really a hodgepodge of different items. But again, we know that that's going to be important, and we need to think seriously about what kind of strategies are going to be useful in an organizational context to really strengthen those relationships, to improve the knowledge sharing, to work together collaboratively towards system change. It's likely to stay in pockets unless we really force it to come out and work together. How are we going to do that? The map's a cross-sectional snapshot. The network, in fact, is going to need to change over time. It's going to change with many factors, including the size of the network, the stage of its evolution. The more developed and the larger a network gets, the more it's going to need some formal governance, administrative support. Again, those aren't highlighted in the map, and that concerns me. Any governance approach is going to need to be fit for purpose and fit for context. Now, purpose is probably fairly well captured in this map, but context isn't. And we know it's absolutely fundamental to how these different partnership strategies are going to play out. Why aren't they paying more attention to the different circumstances the different organizations work in and how those contexts affect the nature of the work that they do together? One of the final things I want to highlight is that while many network scholars focus on tight versus loose kinds of networks and the relative strengths and advantages of this, there's a general consensus that the best way to do it is to develop deep partnerships, connections between partners at the core, but then relatively loose connections at the periphery that allow individual members to be innovative, to be adaptive, to fit the strategy to their local context. So it's that balance between the tight, loose aspects of network performance that you need to get right. And again, no idea how to do that in practice. It's probably going to have to be worked out specifically for every network that you deal with. So as we're starting to see, the complexity of partnering effectively is gradually unfolding as we probe more deeply. It's only going to become more important as I move to the last example, which is scaling up. This is another CIHR-funded project at Propel. It's to do a realist review and synthesis of scaling up from proven effective interventions to a broader application. The challenge is to go beyond the scaling up of discrete interventions and instead to look at what are the strengths or weaknesses of the network of the system for scaling up more generally. What does it take for a system to be good at taking things and putting them into practice, right? So it's intensely participatory, very much involving academic policy and practice perspectives. And if anything, as you scale up, I would think that partnerships and networks are going to become more and more critical at this stage. You're working with new partners, broader coalitions, more senior levels in the system, and somehow you have to figure out how to get those people to give you enough time, to give you the priority to sit down, work together, and figure out how that has to be done. I would guess that there's going to be a critical challenge for TAPS. You can do this initial work with the 28, was it, different studies, Andrew, to get some pieces in the puzzle that need fitting together. But once you've got those, you're going to want to work with all these key stakeholders at policy, management, and practice levels to figure out how they can all work together to produce the national impacts that you're trying to achieve. That's not an explicit part of the research protocol, but how are you going to inform this kind of a collaborative process that very much will become more and more important as TAP works through its funding cycle? So we're just really getting started with this Waterloo study. We've done the preliminary concept mapping and review. We're starting to be clear on what the literature says is important, but we've just recently received funding for an international meeting that'll happen this July to start to interpret some of the findings from the review, to think about how we would actually put that into practice on a broader scale, and how we can come up with an action research agenda that'll really help us move forward. This is a photograph I took a number of years ago outside Brodie Castle in Scotland. In the 18th century, it was common for people to build these kinds of walkways where you could go out in the evening and just wander along. There's one in St. Petersburg in Russia that Catherine the Great put together that has the heads of all the great thinkers sculpted along her balcony so she could walk in the evening and think deep thoughts. So this is your chance to compete with Catherine the Great and others. What I want to do now is to switch gears a little bit and start thinking about, so what does all this mean? I don't have clear answers yet, but we can at least start to think and talk about it. You'll recall that the systems model that we were left with when we worked with the models that were already out there looked something like this. As I think now about what complexity means in terms of where to go with that kind of thinking, I'm not going to suggest another model. The general consensus is there are too many of those out there already. But at least we need to recognize what a complexity lens means for the models that we have. And it seems to me that there are at least two pathways through complexity that we need to understand and to implement as we work towards the kind of knowledge to policy and practice steps that we envision for the future. Some of it's going to be self-organizing. It's going to be recognizing that there are a whole lot of folks out there doing this stuff. It's largely bottom-up innovation, building local teams that are going to collaborate and get things done. And what we need to do as a network, as an organization, is to legitimize those activities, to provide people the time and the opportunity to do that kind of reflection and innovation, to build in the necessary feedback loops, to provide the resources and the platform for a learning network. And then just let it go and let people do the good stuff that they are paid to do. They're smart people, they're committed people, we need to let it happen. However, from an organizational perspective, there are things that we can do. We need to start to create more comprehensive, definitive models of what this system looks like. We need to pay more attention to the multi-level function that policy, management, and practice do different things, but they all have a role to play, and we need to understand how those levels play out together. We need to think more about how to implement different distributed leadership models, how to better orchestrate the strategy, and how to ensure the kind of transparency and accountability that seem to be critical to get the trust and the buy-in for all these diverse stakeholders to work together to make it happen. This is a mind map that I put together about a year ago. I just meant it for me, but I've shared it with a few folks, and everybody says, "Ooh, that's good." So I thought I'd at least share with you as a way to prompt your thinking a little bit. With all of these studies that we've been talking about, there are certain cornerstones that start to emerge. We always understand this need for more distributed leadership and for doing things differently. We almost always see the need for more improved knowledge to action models, better understanding of networks and what makes them effective. The thing we haven't spent a lot of attention to, but we keep hearing is important, is better community engagement. That's something we want to do more of moving forward. all those things combine, each of them having their own science and discipline behind it, to create a science, if you want, of large system transformation. What you see in the circles around this are the specific, simple rules that consistently come out across projects. Things like aligning the incentives with the kinds of changes you want, fostering the necessary relationships, ensuring continuous learning, and so on and so on and so on. It looks like if we do those 16 things well and really align them with some of those cornerstones of transformation, we have every reason to think that that kind of thing is going to start to work. Is there some emerging wisdom from all this? I'm going to put out 4 propositions for you and get you to tell me whether they make sense. So the first point, I think, is that as we start to rely more heavily on more sophisticated, larger networks, we're going to have to move beyond the informal collaboration that tends to be the way these networks evolve now. Usually they lack sufficient clarity around roles, responsibilities, decision-making, accountability. So scaling up only accentuates those kinds of challenges, and there's a sense in which as the network matures, it becomes more of a meta-organization, and it's in need of good governance, in need of resource alignment, in need of more accountability, just like any high-performing organization. And we need to think about what that would look like in practice for the kind of networks and partnerships that we're developing. The second thing is rethinking this top-down, bottom-up balance between the kind of innovation and learning that's critical at the front lines and the kind of top-down accountability that the funders, the legislators are going to require. There's no simple right answer to this. At the moment, the accountability tends to be top-down, rather rigid, improved on top of service functions. And the more that happens, but the bottom-up learning and innovation are under-resourced, unappreciated, and stifled. Now, is that what's happening in your network, in your organizations? I'm guessing that the front lines and the middle management aren't getting the kind of supporting and the resources that they're needing. That's what typically happens. And how do we address that balance and start to get the right kind of a balance between ongoing learning and accountability? The third one I want to talk about is getting serious about power. We're not allowed to talk about it often in Canada. The fact is that the provincial government has the power. They run our healthcare system. And what the politicians decide is the right thing to do is what's going to happen. I understand you just had a change in national government that rather shifted the playing field for prevention. That's the kind of problem that we're talking about. The real power behind system change is often not very visible. It's not at all transparent. But unless some of these fundamentals about the independence of the healthcare system, the power balance between medicine and other disciplines are addressed, it's going to be very hard to break out of the traditional models that we've been living with. And the final thing I wanted to wonder with you about is framing a 10-year memorandum of understanding with all your partners. Get it down in writing. Get people to commit to what the role is going to be, what their contribution is, what they're going to be held accountable for. Now, I know they're not going to sign this piece of paper. I mean, that's just the reality of the world we live in, right? So you can't do that, but I think it's really important with the leadership in your partner organizations that you start with this kind of perspective in mind. Saying, we can't commit to it today, but we know that we're on a 10-year journey together. We know that there are certain things that have to happen along the way if we're going to be successful. Let's agree on what those basics are. Let's agree on how each of us is going to try to contribute. Let's agree on how we are going to hold ourselves accountable. Whether you put it in writing or not, I think that that kind of clarity is going to be important from the get-go if we're to succeed. So, next steps. Well, we've got a workshop that we're putting together with some senior leaders from the UK. It's going to happen at the end of May. It's hosted by the Health Foundation. It's going to bring together 45 really senior people to try to think about this whole systems perspective on knowledge implementation. We're writing a green paper that'll frame those discussions. We'll publish something that comes out of it that synthesizes the kind of feedback we get. It's very much going to have a strong action focus. So it's a step towards starting to formalize some of the things that I've been talking about today. One of the things I hope we can have some conversation about in the question and answer period is the Australian context and what that looks like. I can tell you what it's like for Canada. You know, we have this strong collaborative culture that we can build on. There's at least lip service to recognizing the complexity and the need for transformation. There's pretty widespread agreement that the way we have been doing things for the last 40 years is no longer fit for purpose. We need to change. However, we have a situation where health is a provincial responsibility constitutionally. The federal government's hands are tied in large part, but they get all the taxes. So the current collaboration between the federal and the provincial governments is weak. And we need to figure out better ways to do that in Canada if we're going to succeed with this kind of transformation. And finally, we have a very dysfunctional fee-for-service model for funding MDs. I think you have an advantage in Australia. At least you have a national coordination strategy. At least you have a mandate for trying to put together partnerships that make sense for this context and things you can do together. But what else? What else you need to take into account about the Australian context to start to think about how to apply some of the simple rules, key principles that we've been talking about? I'm going to end with a call to action with 3 questions. What are the indicators for knowledge to action and partnership performance? What are the indicators for system transformation? Might there be a value in international collaboration to try to develop some of those common measures and to compare what happens in the different jurisdictions? And can we come up with a sufficiently rigorous prospective comparative case study methodology so that we really can learn from how the natural experiments that are going on in the different countries and how these things work? Okay, I'm going to end there.